Welcome to Casual Friday. So this week I am going to do a wrap up on the August Sock Knit Along. I'll update you on my current projects, including my project that I'm knitting with my handspun yarn. And then I'll answer a question or two. As always, if you want to jump right from one point of the video to another, there are direct links down in the description. So let's get started. September 15th was the deadline for completing your socks if you wanted to be eligible to win a prize in the August Sock Knit Along. So on the morning of September 16th, I got up and I looked to see how many projects there were in, there was a discussion thread in my Ravelry group that was specifically for people posting their finished projects. There could absolutely be many people who did not post their finished projects to the list, or who didn't even post a project on the Ravelry group. A lot of people just are interested in getting patterns and doing things on their own. They're not interested in the whole group aspect, and maybe are not interested in possibly winning a prize either. But what I found in the discussion group was that there were links to 75 different projects that were associated with the knit along. So at the top of a Ravelry discussion thread, there's information about the number of posts, the number of individuals who have posted in the thread, the number of photos, and the number of projects that are linked to in the discussion thread. So I used that information about 75 projects. I clicked on that, and then I got thumbnails of all 75 projects. So I had 75 projects to choose from, and I decided to award 3 people skeins of yarn that were custom indie dyed yarns from my personal sock yarn stash, and then 2 winners were going to get a free copy of any one of my designs from my Ravelry shop. So I had numbers 1 through 75. I used a random sequence generator that I found on the internet to just reorder those numbers 1 through 75 into a random order. If I had number 17, I just counted what was the 17th thumbnail that was there, and then I would look at the project page and confirm that there were dates, start and complete dates for the project, and that the dates were between or including August 1st to the 15th of September. And if they were, then they got awarded one of the prizes, and then I went down the list until I found the next one that met those criteria. So the 3 winners were Nicole, who's from Quebec, Canada, Grace, who's from British Columbia, Canada, and RJ, who's from Florida. So I went to their project pages and their notebooks just to kind of look at the colors that they tended to use, if I saw any sort of generalized palettes that they tended to prefer in their color selections. And then based on that, I chose the specific skein of yarn that I think would be the best match for them. So those prizes all went out to the post office yesterday, and the recipients should be receiving them sometime. The ones in Canada, they said 2 to 3 weeks. So I think things can get stuck at the border going through customs. And the winners of the patterns have received those. So hopefully everybody will get what they won and will not be disappointed. A number of people have thanked me for running the knit along. They've mentioned that they have knit the best fitting socks that they have ever knit before, which really makes me happy. That was really my goal, was that not just how do you knit socks, but how do you knit socks that fit a very specific person, and how to figure out how that sock should be structured in order to fit that person. So that made me really feel happy. Nicole, one of the prize winners, noticed that I had given a lot of really individualized help in the knit along, and in order to do that, I had created a specific discussion thread just for people who had questions that they wanted to make sure that I could answer, because the general chat thread got so busy I couldn't keep up with it, and I was missing people's questions. So I separated out different discussion threads for the knit along so that I could better keep track of questions that people had that they that they wanted me to answer. And I was happy to answer those questions. I learn so much from the questions that people ask, and it just adds to my own personal body of knowledge. And one of the things that I learned was that is, despite the sort of enormity of experience that I had with different sort of fit issues, that has expanded even more. The second thing that I learned was how difficult it is for many knitters to take an accurate measurement for their heel height. That is, the measurement from the middle of their outer ankle bone, not their inner ankle bone, because some people were measuring that and that's in a different location on the leg, but the midpoint of the outer ankle bone to the floor. And I started realizing that this was a difficult thing for people to measure. So I'll be updating the knit along materials with a part 6 that includes information about how to really accurately get your heel measurement using the heel diagonal. I consulted other sock knitting books and I couldn't find anyone else who used this method of calculating heel height. I did see at least one book that mentioned that getting a heel measurement, an accurate heel measurement will give you a good fitting sock, but also mentioned how difficult it is for knitters to be able to get this measurement accurately. So that was the thing that I found that made the entire knit along worth it for me, putting aside all the other things that made it worth it for me. Another thing I learned is sort of how to run a knit along. There were certain things I kind of had a general idea of, and other things I didn't really know. And having been through this process, I know what I would do differently or how I would set things up differently in the future. One of the things that was very stressful for me was not something that anybody complained about, but it was something that concerned me. And that was that because I was creating these materials and still maintaining my 2 video a week production schedule, and people had questions based on the materials that I was producing, and they were doing their calculations and they had questions, and I was very concerned I wasn't going to be able to keep up. And I got to a point where there were several weeks where I was only able to be on Ravelry about once every 24 hours, and I felt really bad about not being able to answer questions in a more timely way. Again, nobody complained about it and everybody was appreciative of the fact that they were getting individual attention. But in the future, I would set an expectation for myself and for the people participating in that here's how what the time frame is likely to be on getting answers, that you will get an answer, but it might take a day, and depending on the volume of questions, it could take possibly a little longer, because that was really a source of stress for me, and I would like to avoid stress if at all possible. Another question that I've had is, am I planning on doing any knit-alongs in the future? What types of knit-alongs would I be doing? Some people have specific requests for types of knit-alongs that they would like to see me do. And I do anticipate doing a knit-along or two in the future. I don't know what those are going to be. I've had requests specifically for doing a knit-along for toe-up socks. And I'm going to disappoint those of you who would like to see me do that by telling you that is unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future for me. If you watch my Casual Friday videos, and if you've seen them in the past month or so, somebody asked me about advantages and disadvantages of cuff down versus toe up, and I talked about that. And I talked about how it really is an individual preference, whether you prefer cuff down or toe up. And I absolutely do not enjoy toe up. Some people love it, and I really hate it. So again, I want to do things that bring me joy in the process, and that would not bring me any joy. So back in July, when I was writing the materials for the August Sock Knit Along, I knit this first sock, and I used it as to demonstrate various aspects of a sock when I was making videos and taking photographs to include in the documentation. So I knit this sock in middle of July, And then I continued working on the materials, and then a friend of mine had a surprise birthday party and I knit her a pair of socks. And then I started working on that 1930s vintage sweater. At that point, I wanted to do anything except think about socks. So I was spending August working on that vintage sweater. So I returned to my green socks in a few weeks ago or a week ago, and I started knitting on them. And one of the things that was different about this first sock was that I had to go down a needle size. I usually knit my socks with a size 0 needle, and I get 9 stitches per inch. I was using a yarn that I hadn't used before, and I thought, well, maybe that's part of the reason I had to go down a needle size. But I also know that over the past 10 years or so, you know, I'm getting some I have some arthritis sometimes in my hands. My knitting tension has loosened up a little bit, and I thought, well, maybe I just knit looser now, and I'm going to have to knit socks on 00s from now on. So that was kind of in my head, that it was either the yarn or it was my hands. Now, I knit this in July, and we had a very hot July, and my feet and hands swell up in the heat. So my hands were swollen. And then in August, we had a very cool August. The temps were very mild. And in early September, I really thought fall was here. I was starting to wear a sweater. You can see today I'm wearing a summer linen top because it's been in the 80s all week. So when I returned to knitting the second sock, I took out my 00 needles. I started knitting it. I was about halfway down the leg, and I thought, this seems super tight. I looked at my gauge and I held it up compared to the first sock, and I was knitting 10 stitches an inch instead of 9. Like, oh, interesting. Well, I'll go back to using the 0, which is what I normally would have done, and I knit the sock leg. A week or so went by. Then I knit the heel flap. I did the heel turn. I was halfway down the foot when I realized I had worked the heel over a different number of stitches. I worked it over an even number instead of an odd number. I hadn't put a garter stitch frame in it like I had on the first sock. And I thought, oh, do I want to rip this out? Or maybe I'll just make it look intentional, and I'll knit a different toe for this sock than I knit for the first one. And because it's the knit along sock, it's all about experimenting and doing things differently. So I continued on, and I started having the feeling that the foot of the sock was a little loose compared to the first one. And I looked at my gauge, and sure enough, it was looser. Well, it's been hotter this week, so my hands are swollen again. So at that point, when I realized my gauge was also off, I had done the heel differently and my gauge was off, I ripped back to the beginning of the heel. I got my 00 needle out again. I re-knit the heel flap, and I knit it to match the first heel flap. I did the heel, no, I haven't quite, I'm still most of the way, I'm almost all the way through the end of the flap, except I just pulled my needle out accidentally, so I have to get that back in. So this has been an interesting problem for me that I haven't had before. And I know a lot of knitters do struggle with gauge differences with their 2 socks, which is why they knit them 2 at a time. This is an interesting struggle. I'm not noticing gauge issues with the bigger needles. I really think it's a combination of swollen hands and very small needles. But it's something for me to keep in mind in the future when I'm knitting something like this, is to kind of pay attention to what's going on with the weather and my hands. I have noticed when I fly on airplanes, where I typically start knitting a sock, if I have my elbows propped up on the armrests while I'm knitting, my gauge is a ½ stitch looser per inch. So there are things that do affect my gauge. Most of the time in my knitting life, I'm sitting in the same chair in the same position, and things don't change. So variables, there are external variables that can affect your gauge, and this is one that has affected mine. A few weeks ago, I was telling you about my adventures with my drum carder and showing you that I had managed to save some fiber that I thought I had irreversibly felted, but I was able to open up the fiber, and then I made a gradient of roving in order to spin. And so I spent a couple of weeks spinning. And this is another place where my hands were creating a problem. I had a very swollen middle finger in my right hand that made me really not want to do anything for a couple of days. That was going to make it even worse. But I did get through spinning all of the gradient. And the way I did it, some of you are spinners and will understand this, and some of you aren't. So I'm going to try to explain it in a way that hopefully will make sense to you. When you're spinning fiber, you're spinning a yarn that's a single. Some people call it a single ply. It's not really plied until you have two of them that are twisting around each other, but it's a single. And you're spinning it onto a bobbin. And typically, if you're going to make a yarn with two or more plies, you will have separate bobbins of those singles, and then you will take one strand from each of the bobbins. If you're going to do a two-ply, you'll have two bobbins, two strands from two bobbins, and you'll ply those together. If you're going to have a three-ply, you'll have three bobbins, and you'll ply them together. When you're working with a gradient yarn, the challenge is that how are you going to divide that up into multiple bobbins in order to ply them together and have the colors sequences stay together. The way that you can overcome that challenge is to use a special plying method called chain plying. Now, some people call this Navajo plying, and I had in my head something that I'd read in the past year or so that said Navajo plying was an inaccurate term, that the Navajos didn't actually use this, and I was trying to look up information about this to confirm or deny that what was in my head. And I did find some reference to, well, the Navajos mostly use singles for both when they're weaving, for both their warp strands and their weft threads. But they do use chain plying in order to use the leftovers, I think it was, and somehow that this chain plied yarn is maybe attached to the outer part of the weaving. I'm not completely sure. So it's not something that they use all the time is a major component of their spun yarn. So it's not clear to me if the Navajos were the ones who invented it or if someone just know. I don't know, but I think chain plying is a descriptive term for it. And what that chain plying is it allows you to create a three-ply yarn with that single strand, so that you have that, let's say you have a 3-yard strand of a yellow single, that you can make so if it's 3 yards to begin with, you essentially end up with a 1-yard three-ply of that single strand. And the way you do that is sort of like crocheting. So this is a bobbin that is used for spinning. So this is on your spinning wheel, and when you're treadling around on your spinning wheel, this bobbin is spinning around like this. When you have an empty bobbin, you have what's called a leader thread, and typically you want one that has some kind of a loop in it in the middle. And so what you do is, if you have unspun fiber, you just take some of it and you kind of loop it through there, and then you are treadling and you're creating twist in this, and it so that attaches the unspun fiber, twists it into this leader, which gets wound on here. But if you already have a single and you're plying, then you would have the 3 singles would go through there in the same way. So you're attaching it to this leader. So what I have here is a skein of a 1-ply yarn. I don't even know what it is. It's Bernat Roving, it's called. So this is a loosely spun single of yarn that you could use to knit something that's, it's like a super bulky weight yarn. So I want to show you how you can turn this into something that has 3 plies. So the first thing you do is you create a slip knot. So here's that leader. I've got this sitting on my desk here. Here's that leader. You bring your slip knot through that leader, and then the actual working yarn end of the yarn, you pull that through the slip knot like this. So this is your attached business. So this part over here is going to just get twisted up and pulled onto the bobbin. But you have this big loop here, and you can pull this out Let me straighten this out. So you have this big loop, and you grab the working yarn end of the ball, and now you can see you've got 3 strands at this end. Those are going to get twisted together to become the yarn, and you pull that loop through, and again you make it super long, and then this just keeps getting twisted. The 3-stranded part keeps getting twisted, and you just continue doing that. You're continually pulling this loop out, and then this part, the 3-stranded part's getting twisted and getting wound onto the bobbin. So that's what you do if you have something like a gradient yarn, where you're going from one color all the way into shifting into something else, and you want to preserve those color changes. You don't want to combine 3 separate strands that might end up having the colors mismatching at some point. So that's what I did with my gradient yarn. So I spun it into a single, and then the next step that you're supposed to do before you ply something is you're supposed to rewind it onto another bobbin and have the bobbin that where the yarn's being unwound like across a long room away from you, and then you wind it on to a new bobbin. And that's supposed to help distribute the twist, so if you don't have things quite twisted consistently all the way through, that kind of helps distribute the twist. And it also allows you to start plying from the same end that you began creating your single. So for some spinners, that's really important if they think that the direction that the fibers are facing is really important to them and they want to do that. But the main goal is first to distribute that twist more evenly along the strand before you start plying. So I did that, and then I did the chain plying, and I created a ball of yarn, which I will show you up here somewhere. And the thing is, this is only the second ball of plied yarn that I created. I created one like last summer, and then I spent many months not spinning at all, and then I've spent several months spinning on and off, but only creating singles and only really just practicing and not really having a focus of anything. So this is the first time in nearly a year where I actually sort of had an idea of maybe where I wanted to go, and I didn't know at what point things were going to fail. You can be a super technical spinner, and you can be an intuitive spinner. And at this point, I'm just trying to create muscle memory for different ways of creating singles and getting a feel for how thin I want my singles to be, and getting used to my wheel and how to adjust it if I need to as a bobbin fills up, because the tension things change and you have to adjust things. I didn't have a real plan. I was just doing things by feel, and that's not wrong, but it's just the only plan I had. And that's what I went with. I created my yarn, and then I decide, what am I going to do with this single skein? Because one of the problems I had when I dyed this fiber was that I used 2 of the colors I used, apparently notorious for continuing to release color. And secondly, I had oversaturated them. So I'd already put too much dye on the fiber, and then it just keeps re-releasing. So originally I thought maybe I'd combine the yarn into something that was stranded color work, but I was concerned that the dye that keeps releasing isn't going to adhere to itself anymore, because it already is oversaturated with dye. It can't hold any more dye, but I was afraid it would bleed on to the other colors. And so I decided I really needed to figure out something to do with I had exactly 100 grams of this yarn, and it was about, I thought maybe about 180 yards worth. So roughly worsted weight, maybe slightly thicker than worsted weight, except that it's, a little bit thin and thick all the way through. Hats don't usually need a full 100 grams. I could have knit mittens, but then I'd have 2 different gradients, and again, they don't usually need a whole 100 grams. So I was trying to think of something that I could actually use the full 100 grams or as close to it as I could, and I decided it was going to be a cowl. That's what I did with my first hand spun. It's what I'm doing with this. What I ended up doing was, so this is what it is in progress, and the colors are not showing up. It looks to me on my monitor, it looks like purple and orange, and it really is more of a gradient. I can probably get a better photo of it in different light, But I'm using the stitch pattern that I used for my first vintage sweater, which is this zigzag pattern. It's knit 5, purl 5 all the way around, and then in the next round you shift over one. So so that the knit 5, purl 5 is shifted over. You do that for 5 rounds, and then the 6th round is knit exactly the same, and then the 7th round goes back in the other direction. So rounds 5 and 6 and rounds 10 and 1 are exactly the same. So I cast on in pattern and used that and counted my cast on as row number 1, and then I continued on. And what I'm doing, I'm using a spreadsheet, which is something I always do when I create a pattern, but I think it's really important for something like this with the hand spun and where you have a stitch pattern and you're trying to figure out how far is this going to go. So I started with 100 grams. Every 5 or 10 rounds, I'm weighing what I have left, and then I'm calculating how many stitches I've knit so far, and so how many stitches per gram I'm getting, and then multiplying that out to see the likely number of total stitches that I'm going to be able to get from this. And because my yarn is not totally consistent, it was a little thicker at the purple end than it is at the orange end, so I'm getting more stitches in this cowl than I originally thought I would get. So I'm keeping track of that so that I will know at what point I'm going to need to cast off. And then I'll hopefully be able to use all but just a few yards of this yarn. So one of the things that I'm not really clear on is what hand spun yarn, a good hand spun yarn, actually feels like or looks like. I've only felt and seen my own hand spun up close. And one of the things, I'm very used to commercial yarns and how they feel. And one of the things that I've been told over and over again is that commercial yarns are loosely spun because then they get more yardage out of it. Because the more tightly spun something is, the more that shrinks up the yarn in length. And so they try to maximize their yarn. So this definitely feels different, but I don't know if that's because I spun it badly or over applied it, or I don't know. And so I want to see if I can talk to some other spinners at the next monthly spinning group and see if I can feel some of their yarn and get a sense of what my target is, because you have so many choices in spinning about how you prepare the fiber, how you spin it, how you ply it, how you finish it. All of these things are so many variables, and the only target I have is a commercial yarn. That's the only thing I know of, and if that's considered not good because it's loosely spun, then I don't know what I am aiming for. So I would kind of like to get some experience of seeing what other yarns look like up close and being able to feel them and finding out, well, how did you prepare this? How did you draft this? How did you apply this? You know, all of that kind of thing, to learn more about what it is that I want to do. The first question is not a knitting question. It was a question about what does buy a coffee mean? Because if you look at my video descriptions, the first thing that's always under there is buy me a coffee on Ko-fi.com, and then there's a link. And then you'll see in the end screens at the end of my videos, it'll say support me on Ko-fi.com/Roxanne Richardson. And I haven't talked about this in a long time. I talked about it a year ago when I first started doing Ko-fi. So Ko-fi is sort of like Patreon, if you're familiar with that. Patreon is more of a subscriber situation. On Ko-fi, the creator sets what the increment of donation is. So in my case, it's $3, and I call it a coffee. So like if we were at a coffee shop and we were knitting together and I really helped you at a disaster or something on your project, and I really helped you out with it, and you were so relieved that you weren't going to have to rip everything out, you might say, oh, let me buy you a coffee. That's kind of the idea, is that somebody helped you, like maybe one of my videos helped you, or you just enjoy the creator's content if they're doing something that's entertainment, whatever it is. Sometimes when people, I have found one of the fixing mistakes video or something like that, they've saved their project and they just buy me a coffee that And what it is they are sending me $3 through PayPal, and Ko-fi is just the sort of the interface, the way to do that. Ko-fi doesn't take anything. The money goes directly to me into my PayPal account. Of course, PayPal takes a little percentage. So sometimes people buy me 2 coffees or 3 coffees, and they do have an option for doing a subscription. Like if you wanted to buy a coffee every month, it would automatically, there'd be an automatic payment that would get set up where every month on the same date, your PayPal account would pay my PayPal account $3. I'm actually really grateful. This is one of the things I was terrified about doing a year ago because I thought it could backfire and that I would end up feeling terrible, like if nobody wanted to support me. And then I was doing these videos that people liked, but nobody thought it was worth supporting me over. I was worried about that I would then if that happened, how would I feel about continuing to do videos? But luckily, enough people have supported me that I feel very good about it. Because a Ko-fi generates a certain amount of money for me every month, it has enabled me to buy a new sound recording piece of equipment just in the past week, because the piece of equipment I was using, you can see I have a microphone here. That microphone is plugged into a little recorder. And so I record the audio at the same time that I'm recording my camera. My camera has a microphone, but when it's from this distance, if I use the camera mic, it would sound very echoey in here. And occasionally that recorder is temperamental and it doesn't work, and I do end up having to record with the echoey sound. That happened a week ago, not this week, but a week ago on the Tuesday video. I was doing my overhead recording and I had spent 20 minutes recording a video. I went to turn the recorder off and it had turned itself off. There was no audio. My husband is like MacGyver, and he can always fix things and get them running again. But the problem was that there was this this thing would do things like it would be recording, but I couldn't turn it off. And then because I couldn't turn it off, I had to unplug it. Then it wouldn't save the recording. Or it would get where it would stay on. It would never turn. Like I could record on and off, but I couldn't turn the power off. And then it got so it wasn't turning on at all. And he MacGyvered it into getting it to work so that when I went to visit Margaret last week at her dye studio, that I was able to record it. But in the meantime, I bought a new piece of equipment that makes me feel like I'm Scotty on the Enterprise, and I'm going to beam somebody up. Like, there's so many dials on this. It's way bigger than this previous recorder, but it's at least working, and it has some big buttons on it that I can see, and it's not a cheap piece of equipment. So the fact that people have supported me with Ko-fi makes me feel, oh, I can afford to buy this piece of equipment that will make my videos sound good going forward. So that's what Ko-fi is. So there was another question I got on a video. It's a video I made a while back, but the comment came just this week. And it was on a video on seaming. It was mattress stitch. And the question was, is mattress stitch a new thing? She said, I've only heard about it in the past couple of years, and I've been knitting a long time. So this is a mystery that I have been trying to solve for several months. And that is, when did mattress stitch appear as a knitting technique, as a common knitting technique? I'm still not really sure. I know from looking at the 19th century plain needlework manuals that nothing about seaming was ever in the sections on knitting. There would be sections on cutting out garments, such as for shirts or frocks or things like that. And then there would be a lot of information about different ways of seaming and stitching things closed. So because there's nothing mentioned in the knitting sections, my assumption is that they were using the same techniques, whatever that they used for the woven fabrics, that they were using for the knitted fabrics. And in these early sweater patterns from the early century, a lot of times they don't tell you how to seam, just like contemporary patterns won't. They'll just tell you to seam. But once in a while, you'll get a pattern that will mention specifically to use backstitch. So when I learned to knit back in 1986, I bought a pattern, needle, and yarn, and started working on a sleeveless V-neck top. But I'd wanted to buy a knitting reference book that I couldn't afford until the next week when I got paid again. And the book that I bought was this book here. Was called The Knit Kit. And it had a bunch of different patterns in the front. There are these different cards that each had a pattern on them. And then there was this reference section right here. Well, when it came to sewing up my little top, I don't think I looked in here how to do it. I just assumed I knew how to sew a seam together, and I used backstitch. And that was something that I used for at least 10 years until I got a knitting machine. I got interested in a knitting machine, and I bought one, and I had a book on machine knitting, and I was reading through there, and that's where I think the first time I ever grafted anything, I grafted the shoulders of a little sweater I made for my daughter who was like a year old. And then they had information on the side seams, and it was mattress stitch. And so those were two new techniques for me. And the only reason I came across them is because it was machine knitting, and I was just reading the whole book on that, where with the hand knitting, for whatever reason, I didn't think to look up how to seam. So from then on, I kind of knew about mattress stitch. And then when I did the Master Hand Knitting program, of course, that was what we had to do. And really all of my technique books since then, anything that has anything in there about seaming has mattress stitch in it. So that was the mid-80s. So sometime between the early 20th century and the 1980s, people started doing mattress stitch. So I've been trying to figure out when that was. And I was looking at Barbara Walker. I pulled up Barbara Walker's Knitting from the Top book. Let me go get it. It's this book here. I mean, the sweater on the front, you know, the clothing on the front is a bit dated, but Barbara Walker's such a genius. But this book was published in 1972, and she has in these different sections how to knit different types of garments, starting from the top going down rather than starting at the bottom and going up. And she created two different ways, for example, of doing set-in sleeves from the top down, both of which are used in contemporary patterns today. And I was just curious, and one of the things that she mentions in this book when you're knitting a sweater from the top down is doing short row shaping for the shoulders. And she advocated wrap and turn short rows, which is perhaps one of the first mentions of that maybe in a broadly available book. The patterns I've been finding up until that point, up until the 60s anyway, were when they use short rows, typically would just turn and slip the stitch, and on the return to that slip stitch there might be a technique that produces a result like Japanese short rows or German short rows, but that was really consistent, that was the type of short row technique that was used. Mary Thomas's 1938 book talks about a wrap and turn, but she never picks up the wraps. But Barbara Walker specifically talks about how to pick up the wraps. So I wondered if maybe there was something in here about mattress stitch or ladder. It has other names, ladder stitch or various things. So I looked in this book, and she talked about seaming seams, and she says some knitters like to crochet the seams, some like to overcast or backstitch on the wrong side, some like to slip the first stitch of every row and then weave these slipped loops together, which I'm trying to figure out if that's a Bickford seam or what exactly she's talking about there. Some like to work the edge stitches in garter stitch by knitting the first stitch of every row and then picking up the bumps on each side to make the seam. And again, I'm wondering exactly if she's just talking about going back and forth and picking up the bumps like that. I'm not sure. Then she says, most knitting teachers recommend weaving the seam from the right side by putting the yarn needle into the center of the second stitch in from the side edge and bringing it out through the center of the next stitch above, then repeating the process on the other side edge. So that would create a seam that's 1.5 stitches wide on each side. So I thought, I have never heard of that. That's really interesting. And then she said, my favorite method is similar to the last one, but with a difference. I like to weave the seam from the right side through the edge stitches instead of through the second stitches from the edge. This gives an invisible seam with hardly any bulk at all. What she's saying here is what I would call mattress stitch, but a half stitch mattress stitch. So she's saying use a half a stitch from each of the selvages and then you can create a seam. Nowhere does she mention going between stitches, between the edge stitch and the second stitch in, which is what mattress stitch is. Oh, then I went and looked in Elizabeth Zimmerman's book, and she, of course, wanted to avoid purling at all costs and also avoid seaming at all costs. She had some things to say about seaming too that were quite different, and again, didn't include mattress stitch. But I think it was her book that mentioned, well, every magazine has instructions on how to seam. And I thought, oh, well, that's something. I'd only been looking at pattern books and then trying to look at knitting technique manuals. So I actually have a couple of magazines from the 60s, including a Vogue magazine. And some of those old patterns or magazines will tell you to use backstitch. And then some of them talk about woven seams, which is basically what she was talking about, where you're doing mattress stitch but in the edge stitch. And I'm still not finding anything that says doing it between the first and second stitch in. So I want to go through these and do some swatches and see if I can figure out some of these other seaming methods she's talking about. But I would really love to know if any of you remember the first time you heard about mattress stitch. It may have been called a ladder stitch or some other name. If you have any idea where you first saw that. So I'd be really interested. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.